Good day, Year 9, and welcome to the last of the movement of substances lessons, where we are looking at active transport, which is very different to the two that we have looked at in previous lessons, diffusion and osmosis. We need to be able to compare those three ways in which substances move in and out of cells. So, quick question, you don't need to write this down, but can you work out what the blanks would be? Diffusion is the movement of particles blank, a blank gradient from an area of blank concentration to an area of blank. Have a go at working those out. You may want to pause the video. Okay, so hopefully we have figured out that diffusion is the movement of particles down a concentration gradient from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Now, the reason why I've put this in here is because I keep referring to concentration gradients, and I did try and explain what a concentration gradient is, but it's been included in this lesson just to make sure that we are happy with the idea of it. So what we're going to be looking at is, as I say, active transport, and we need to understand how active transport works and why it is important. So the same as with diffusion and osmosis, the mechanism of how it works, and then why it's so important. So where does it happen in cells and why is that important? Okay, so what is a concentration gradient? Now, you may have come across the word gradients in maths before when talking about graphs. But hills and graphs have gradients, okay, and it's about how steep it is. So looking at these three road signs, which one has got the steepest gradient, and which move up a gradient, and which move down a gradient? So which ones are going up a gradient and which are the ones that are showing going down a gradient? Pause the video, work out those answers, and we'll go through it when you come back. Okay, so hopefully you've had a think about it. Which is the steepest gradient? The answer will be the 30% in the center, because it's got the steepest gradient, is the steepest. Number two, which move up a gradient? So that would be the 30% and the 13%. And which moves down a gradient? That's the 10% because it's going downhill, whereas the other two are showing uphill. Okay, so diffusion and concentration gradients, and this works as well with osmosis, but obviously we're not showing a partially permeable membrane in the middle, which is an important part of osmosis. So in diffusion osmosis, they're moving down a concentration gradient. So if you have a look on the left-hand side, you will see that there are more particles in area, so that has got a higher concentration. And then on the right-hand side, you've got less particles, so a lower concentration. Now, if you put this into graph form, it will form something that looks like the triangle that you can see in the middle. So which way will the particles move? Hopefully, we realise that it's going to go from the left-hand side, where there's more particles, a higher concentration, to the right-hand side. And that's happening down a concentration gradient. So hopefully that has helped make more sense in your head about what a concentration gradient actually means in science. Now, active transport is very different to the past two, diffusion and osmosis, because sometimes we need to move molecules the other way. So instead of it going from a high concentration to a low concentration down a concentration gradient, we actually need to go the other way. So we need to go from low concentration to high concentration against or up the concentration gradient. Now, that doesn't just happen. You have to use energy to actually move those particles from one place to another. So in diffusion osmosis, it doesn't require energy, so we say that it is passive. But in this one, in active transport, it does require energy, so it is not passive. So that is why it's called active transport. So you're moving things and it requires energy. So if we go back to the graph that we were looking at last time, instead of going from left to right, we're going the other way against that concentration gradient, from right to left, and that is requiring energy. Now, to link to one of the first lessons that I've done on here, where in the cell is energy, I'd like to say made, but we know that energy cannot be created or destroyed. Where is energy produced? Hopefully, we have remembered that energy is created in respiration, and that happens in the mitochondria. Okay, so let's have a look at how active transport works. Now, for any of you PE GCSE students, you might already know what ATP is. In science, you do not need to know what ATP is at GCSE level, but just bear in mind that the ATP is the molecule that will release that energy. So on the left-hand side, we've got the inside of a cell, and you can see that there are more particles in a given area, so it's got a higher concentration. On the outside of the cell, we've got less particles, so there's a lower concentration. And that picture in the middle is showing a membrane. That's what a membrane actually looks like. Again, you don't need to know that at GCSE. And in the middle, we've got something that's actually going to be doing the moving, because we want those green particles. So we need to move them from the outside to the inside. But that's not just going to happen passively, because it's going from low to high. So those particles that are on the outside will connect up with this special blue image in the middle, which is actually a carrier protein. So we have special proteins in our cell membranes that will actually connect with those particles, and then using energy from that ATP, it will move them. Sorry about that. It will move them from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. And what that ADP and P is representing is that energy has been released. So it's taking the energy to physically move them from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. Okay, so now a little bit of work from you guys. So in your notes, can you write a definition of active transport? So all of the previous ones, I've given you the definitions for it, or it's been a fill in the gap. And this one, I want you to come up with your own definition for it. And I would like you to have a go at doing that using the 3 words, or including the 3 words that are underneath. So energy, concentration gradient, and pumps. Now, once you've done that, you can have a go at thinking about where that might happen in us or in plants, and why that's going to be important. So if you could pause the video and do those tasks, and I'll see you or speak to you in a few. Okay, so hopefully we've had a go at those questions. As usual, you don't have to use a purple pen. You can use a different colour, just see where you're getting the points from. So the first question, or the first activity, you had to write a definition for active transport in your own words. Now, yours will probably be different to the one that I've just put on the slide. That doesn't matter as long as you've got the important information. So we've got active transport that is happening through a partially permeable membrane. So that makes it similar to osmosis. It moves particles from low concentration to a higher concentration. So that makes it unique. This happens against the concentration gradient, again making it unique. And it requires energy, again making it unique. So the energy is needed to pump or move particles the wrong way. So this is the answer to the next bit where we're thinking about where it might happen. So it's moving things or pumping things in the wrong way. So where might that actually happen? Places that we have spoken about before, it's actually glucose from the intestine into the blood. So because there is going to be a higher concentration of glucose in the blood compared to the intestines, it has to be actually moved over into the blood. Now, in order for that to happen, it means that there are cells in the lining of the intestine that will contain large numbers of mitochondria. So that will be an adaptation of those cells. The most common, and the one that the specification also points to, the most common use of active transport is to do with plants. And we're looking again at a very familiar cell, the root hair cell. Now, we were looking at the root hair cell when we were doing about osmosis, and osmosis moves the water from the soil into those root hair cells, and that's happening without any energy. But the roots also take in minerals, mineral ions. Now, those minerals are really, really important to plants because they add it to the glucose along with other things to make all of the different molecules that they have inside them, all the different proteins and lipids and things like that. Now, in the soil, there's going to be a relatively low concentration of mineral ions compared to what's actually already in the plant. So it needs to use active transport to move those mineral ions from the soil into those root hair cells. And it does that using carrier proteins. Now, you don't need to worry about the term carrier proteins, but it's these proteins that use energy, as you can see in the picture on the top left. They use energy to move molecule or particles from a low concentration to a high concentration. Okay, next task. What I would like you to do is create a Venn diagram that looks like the one that you can see, where you have got these overlapping circles. One of them is going to have active transport, one of them osmosis, and one of them diffusion. And I'd like you to put into the relevant places of the Venn diagram what makes them unique, so what only happens in one of those ways molecules move, or a combination of them. So for instance, if there is something specific to active transport, like requiring energy, it'll go in the part of the circle where there's writing active transport. If it happens, because it happens across a partially permeable membrane, that's going to go in the overlapping bit between active transport and osmosis. But it doesn't happen in diffusion, so it's going to be nowhere in that diffusion circle. So make it large on your paper or in your book, so that you can add all of the things that we've done in the 3 types of movement of substances into the relevant places. So can you pause the video now and do that task? Okay, now because I am not that tech savvy, I couldn't add all of it onto the Venn diagram. So I've created a table that has some of the main differences and similarities between them. So does it require energy, which I already said, that's only in active transport. So that should be in the part of the circle that's only for active transport. The other two do not require energy, they are passive. Does it require a membrane? So active transport and osmosis does. So where they overlap, you should have partially permeable membrane or semi-permeable membrane, but not in the diffusion one, because you don't need a membrane. It happens across some membranes, but you don't need a membrane. You could have talked about the concentration gradient, which you can see at the bottom. So in active transport, that is moving things from low concentration to high concentration or against the concentration gradient. The other two are moving things down a concentration gradient. You may have put for osmosis on its own that it's specifically to do with water particles. Something that is similar for all of them, you could talk about how it's to do with movement of particles. That would be something that is common in all three of those. I've also put some examples of where it is happening. So in diffusion, we talked about carbon dioxide and oxygen diffusing in the leaf through the stomata, and the oxygen diffusing across the alveoli into the blood. For osmosis, we mainly stuck to plants, and we spoke about how it keeps their cells turgid, which means that they're able to be upright. We talked about the water moving through the root hair cells, so that would be osmosis as well. And something that comes up in the triple science next year is talking about water in the kidneys. So when you are dehydrated, you would have darker urine, and that's because your kidneys are taking the water out. Active transport, we spoke about the glucose in the small intestine and the minerals or the mineral ions in the root hair cells. So we're going to have a go at some questions now, and I'd like you to have a go at all of the questions, but if you are aiming for a grade 5, then if you only pick up a couple of points on the grade 7, then that's absolutely fine. So the kind of grade 5 question that you might get is perhaps looking at some data and making a decision. Most of the time for a grade 5, it's going to be explaining. So you need to be able to say why something is happening or why something isn't happening. So for the grade 5, it says, look at the table. Is it possible for the plant to take up sulfate ions by diffusion? Explain your answer. And it's going to be worth 2 marks. So you've got a table there that tells you the concentration of sulfate ions in barley, in the roots, and then it gives you the concentration in the soil. And it's asking whether they'll be able to move into the roots by diffusion. For the grade 6, describe 2 examples where diffusion is used in living things. It's worth 2 marks. So you can't just state the 2 places it happens in living things, be it animals or plants. You have to actually talk about what is happening for those 2 things. And for the grade 7, we've got quite a good question here. So some scientists investigated the rates of absorption in the small intestine. In one experiment, they used a piece of intestine poisoned with cyanide. Now, cyanide is poisonous because it prevents respiration. Explain why cyanide would prevent active transport occurring. 3 marks. So I'd like you to pause the video now and have a go at those questions. Okay, welcome back. So hopefully we've had a go at these 3 questions, ranging from 2 to 3 marks. So the first question for grade 5 was asking about the table looking at the table and asking if it's possible for sulfur ions to move by diffusion. Now on the table it had that inside the roots the concentration was 1.4 and in the soil it's 0.15. So the answer is no, as there are more ions in the root, or a higher concentration of ions in the root than there is in the soil. So that'll be 1 mark. To transport them from low to high concentration or against the concentration gradient. So you need to be saying about how in diffusion it only goes from high to low concentration. For grade 6, a reminder of the question, it said describe 2 examples where diffusion is used in living things. So you could talk about how root hair cells, water is happening in root hair cells. So I know that that's osmosis, but it'll be the diffusion of those water particles. I realise it's put glucose in the small intestine, but we've already said that that is active transport, so that wouldn't be year 1, so I don't know why that was on there, so apologies for that. You could talk about in the alveoli, so the movement of oxygen across the membrane in the alveoli. You could talk about the movement of carbon dioxide from the blood into the alveoli. You could talk about the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide through the stomata in a plant. So as long as there is a description of what is happening, then that would get you the mark. The last one said some scientists investigated the rates of absorption in the small intestine. In one experiment, they used a piece of intestine poisoned by cyanide. Cyanide is poisonous because it prevents respiration. Explain why cyanide would prevent active transport occurring. 3 marks. Okay, so if you have said about how active transport requires energy, that would be a mark. I said energy from respiration. And it needs that energy to move it against the concentration gradient, or you might have said from low to high concentration. And if you've mentioned that is the proteins or substances in the cell membrane that are actively doing that, then that will be your 3rd mark. Okay, so we have come to the end of our movement of substances across not just across a membrane, so the movement of substances in organisms, and the end of the week. So I will be back again next week, where I'll be moving on to the next chapter. As always, I hope that you are well, and well done for keeping on going. I know that it is very tricky without being able to do the practicals and actually see it happening. So hopefully Miss Corbett's videos have helped with that. Do keep going. We're going to look at cell division next week. And yeah, I will see you there, or you'll hear from me there anyway. Thank you very much. Have a lovely weekend.